Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel on censorship and self-censorship in Russia. My name is Will Pomerantz. I'm Deputy Director here at the Kennan Institute. And before I turn the program over to Sergei Parhomenko, our Kennan Institute Senior Advisor, I just have a few brief announcements. Today's program, as well as detailed information about the speakers, can be found in the program available outside. If you did not get one of these programs, then our staff can circulate them here. In addition, the program will be conducted in both English and in Russian, and therefore, if you need translation, headsets are available as well. Finally, I just wanted to give you some announcements about some upcoming events this week. It's a very busy week here. Tomorrow, Wednesday, February 19th at 2 p.m., we will have a talk by Tatiana Vegramenko, who is going to be speaking on the KGB photography and films, the image of the enemy. And then on Thursday, February 20th at 4 o'clock, we will have a talk by Gulburna Akskan, who is going to be speaking on China's business in Central Asia, power and anxiety. So a busy week here at the Kennan Institute. And with that, I will turn it over to Sergei. Sergei?
Thank you.
Floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Will. Good afternoon, everybody. I have some closest friends here on this table. I'm very happy on this, and we will try to start with some brief speeches, and then I will ask you for your questions and your comments for these declarations. So let's try to start with Konstantin Eggert.
Yes.
Kostya, you probably have the longest and most diverse journalistic biography of all the people at this table. You worked for BBC Russian service for many years, and then now for Deutsche Welle. And before it was Izvestia during the greatest period, the period of power and glory of Izvestia in 1919s. And between it was Kommersant and daily columns on Kommersant FM radio. I remember very well you chronics. It was a part of my
daily routine.
Daily ritual, yes, just as brushing my teeth. So probably you experience many different kinds of censorship in your life, and you must have learned to work close with censorship and to resist it. Tell us what this experience has really got to you, and was censorship able to kill Russian journalism after so many years of fighting, and how effective censorship in Russia yesterday and today. And to me personally, maybe the most important thing, what is the role of self-censorship in this battle?
Yeah. Thank you, Sergei, and thanks to the Kennan Center for organizing this event. I'd like to start with actually a story from my own life, which dates back to the first days when I became a journalist, and that was 1990, October 1990, just a couple of months after President Gorbachev signed the first and miraculously still alive law on freedom of the media. I just discharged from the army and was looking for a job. And I thought that it would be interesting to go into journalism because that was literally the first weeks of Russian dependent journalism. And essentially what I did, I just walked into the newspaper offices of the now defunct daily, at that time was actually weekly, which is called Kuranty, the bell clock tower on the Kremlin. That's how the name is translated. And asked people there, what do I need to do to work as a journalist? And they said, well, go and ask the editor-in-chief. The editor-in-chief, God bless him, is still alive, received me in his very small cubicle, and the newspaper, as I said, existed for only 4 months, 4 weeks or 6 weeks, something like that. I sat down in front of him, and he said, "So, young man, what are your plans?" And I said, "Well, I wanted to try and become a journalist now that it's possible in the Soviet Union." It was still the Soviet Union. He said, "And what are the skills that you possess?" And I said, "Well, essentially I speak 3 languages." "Which ones?" I said, "English, French, and Arabic." "Okay. What else do you know?" I said, "Frankly speaking, I'm a historian by my second education, which means absolutely nothing." And he suddenly jumps on his chair and says, "That is exactly what we need." Why I'm telling this story? It's because in this late perestroika, early Yeltsin days, journalism was very much fed and developed by people who had nothing to do with Soviet journalism as such. And the whole idea of those people that created Kuranty, Nezavissimaya Gazeta, and the rest of it was that people who experienced Soviet type of journalism shouldn't be working journalism, actually, because these are propagandists and not journalists. And I think that although the 1990s were not, I would say it wasn't a kind of First Amendment paradise, but of course it was a time when journalism was developing fast, and where the idea that media freedom is important as such was fairly well received by the society and, by the way, by the political class. I still do certain projects for the European Union in Russia, which is educational projects for students. They're not about journalism. But when they Google me, they ask me when we sit down for tea or something slightly stronger after, they start asking questions about, how life was in the 1990s. What happened? Is it true that there was freedom of the media in Russia? I say, well, it wasn't an ideal situation, but of course much better than today. And I usually give them an example that in 1995, during the first war in Chechnya, you could watch Canal Россия, which is now, still is, the main state channel, and you'd find people as diverse as Gennady Zyuganov and Sergei Kovalyov criticizing the Kremlin, Boris Yeltsin, live on TV without any repercussions. That's not possible today in Russia. Unfortunately, I think that these glory days, quote unquote, are gone, and they are not gone for it's not accidentally that they went. It's not only Putin that is to blame for that, but it's societal developments which called for a certain element of uniformity, and that definitely coincides with the makeover that Putin's regime inflicted on the Russian mind. And the current level of censorship grew out of the society gradually deciding that it doesn't want to know, or at least significant parts of society, not all society. I think that before I come to specific issues of censorship, I'd like to give another example, or rather share a thought. I think that what was underestimated in the 1990s, when we had all these people criticizing Boris Yeltsin live on television, what we missed is that Russia goes, and was going, still goes, and will go, when I die, through 3 simultaneous transitions. It's a transition from state-owned, basically state economy to market economy, from totalitarian/authoritarian state to democracy, and from an empire to a nation state. It's not my thought. It's actually Jeffrey Hosking, professor at Birkbeck College, who formulated it first. And this very, very intense 3-pronged transition is complicated by the fact that Russians did not, it's not like Poland, they were not occupied. The Soviet reality was imposed on Russians by Russians for 75 years. So this desire to go back to the safe certainties of the previous age is very strong. And that is what, to my mind, Putin very, very cleverly used. Today, people are saying, well, was it better when you had 3 oligarchs plus one, basically the Kremlin, owning 4 main TV channels in Russia? Channel 1, Kanal Rossiya, NTV, and TVC, Lushkov. Yeah. I say, yeah. Yes, we understand that every single one of them had a certain job to perform and certain editorial conditions that were very strict. But you had 4 opinions on television, 4 different. Now, there is no difference. It's just only the picture that changes and, well, the weather forecast probably. But I think that with regard to censorship, of course, there are 2 main elements of it. And they are parts of a system that is very well built in Russia. There is direct censorship, which is basically operational, especially with regard to state-owned and state-controlled media like Channel 1 or NTV. There you have very strong connection between, say, the Kremlin and the editors. But let me put it like that. By now that 20 years have passed of Mr. Putin's rule, a lot of people don't need to be told what to say and how to present certain topics. They already know. It's not self-censorship, it's just living in censorship. And there are lots of examples of investigative journalists in Russia publishing sort of in-house emails about how we cover this and that and what kind of speakers do we invite and which we don't invite. So with the state media, it's quite clear. With the so-called private media, for example, like our former employer, Kommersant, it is a bit more complex and a bit better camouflaged. It is the owner who is the main filter between the journalists and the authorities. And this owner also plays a game with you. He tells you, or you infer from what they say, is that, well, you see, you work for me. That means that you say, you broadcast, you write what I tell you. Because in a sense, it's my media. What I want to do, I'm going to do with it. So the idea that there's ethos and there are certain things that that constitute public interest, if you wish, has dissipated over these 20 years. And this ownership, this private ownership, in fact, is not that different from the state ownership because of media, because in fact there are no property rights in Russia, as Mr. Khodorkovsky learned to his chagrin in 2003, 2013. So any property right is conditional. And any private owner of a media organization knows it. And although in theory it can be anything, in fact, you have to toe the Kremlin line. It is also enforced by a very, very strong monitoring, which I think is done partially on it's basically computer systems, for example, that monitor broadcasts and filter web publications. I think there are elements also of people actually reading things, especially reading is important for the masters of Russia. They actually are very much people from the 20th century. They prefer paper. I'll give an example how it works. In 2011, I was deputy editor-in-chief of Kommersant FM, which is part of Kommersant Publishing House, and Russia's first proper all-news radio, 24/7 news radio. And Kommersant ran snippets from an interview by the then president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, which was taken by one of the members of Andrei Cherkasov's team for the printed I forgot what it was, a newspaper or a magazine. But he shared the audio, which was recorded in high quality. And we decided to run snippets from this interview, bits and pieces. It's a very fast radio. And we started broadcasting exactly at the moment when we started our weekly editorial meeting at 6 p.m. So the interview goes out at 6:02, and we know it. By 6:24, the editor-in-chief gets a call from the director general of the whole media company saying, XYZ, what is this crazy Saakashvili saying on air? So what? Oh, he said something about the Sochi Olympics, that they're going to be insecure, and you know who didn't like it? Which means the owner, which means the crowd, I don't know. Someone who is very important. But, it's already broadcast. Okay, just don't repeat it. Pull off the bit with the Sochi Olympics. Well, let me be frank. It was pulled down. This piece was not repeated in the repeats. But can you imagine? It's about 24 minutes or 27 maybe that took from this thing to be broadcast for the editor-in-chief to get the call. Whatever works there, it's a very good communications channel, really. And you get these stories by tons, not even by the dozens in Russia. And in this respect, whenever you hear that, in most cases, not in all cases, but in most cases, especially if it's an important media organization, you say, oh, we're privately owned. Yes, you are privately owned. That does not mean that your editorial policy is independent. The Kremlin has, and just coming to self-censorship and wrapping up, the Kremlin has certain ways of also ensuring that its views are heard even by those who belong to notionally critical or opposition media. Every time something important happens, I don't know, there's a pension reform in Russia as it was a year and a half ago, or I don't know, Putin's first meeting with Trump, or the Kremlin sends planes to Syria, or the army to Syria, or something else. All editors-in-chief of all media organizations are invited to the Kremlin for a chat, for a briefing, which is a normal practice in many places, to have a background briefing on things. But I think when it comes to the more interesting thing is not just some Kremlin rep telling you, our view of this is that, and our view of that is this. It actually is very frequently wrapped up by recommendations for coverage. For example, as a follow-up, lists of experts are sent out to the media that are recommended to comment on this or that event, this or that decision by the government. Well, you may decide not to use them, but then you'll get this proverbial phone call probably. And as unfortunately colleagues from Commissant discovered when I already left by that time. When you own notionally privately owned media organization, but you go a bit too deep in the direction that is not recommended, like, for example, digging up the secret ukaz, the secret decree by Putin decorating one of his lieutenants with the highest Russian award for heroes, for something which we don't know what it was, actually. Deputy Chief of Presidential Administration. Decimation falls on you, and that is in spite of the fact that your circulation is boosted, your readership is boosted, if it's a radio or TV or whatever, your clickability is boosted, and your audience goes up, and your advertising goes up. And that creates a climate in which it happens once, it happens twice, it happens thrice, and then people realize where the red lines are. And here we come to self-censorship. I had to self-censor when Putin divorced. And it was very clear to me, even before anyone called me, that the name of his alleged girlfriend, who is a gymnast and Olympic champion, shouldn't be mentioned on the air. And they knew it, and they said, well, let's go without it. In the end, lots of other demands were imposed on me, and I resigned. But I think I can easily admit I have self-censored. Very frequently, you feel that it's part of your job because you have to defend your team. If you don't do it, people are going to lose jobs. You're going to be evicted and someone worse will come. Of course, that's always an explanation. But in the end, it, of course, corrupts you. I mean, it depletes your ability to work normally. And I think, I don't know yet, but I suppose it also inflicts certain, it perverts your thinking. And that stays with you even when you're gone. And I think that when it's repeated, for example, with the same media organization, when they have 3 editors-in-chief in a row changing in, let's say, 5 years, people get the message. And the interesting thing also is that when, say, in Putin's first terms and until the protests in Moscow in 2011, 2012, it was very clear that there were some areas where you could basically forget about. I mean, where the Kremlin didn't tread, where they were not important. Culture, something like that. After the protests in Moscow, after the realization in the Kremlin that things shouldn't be let unsupervised, even if it's book reviews or film reviews, censorship intruded there. Look at, I'm not going to name the name, but there are very serious deliberations by a publishing house which is supposed to publish a book on Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as to what the repercussions would be. I understand these people. It wouldn't have been a problem 10 years ago. So to wrap up, because Sergei is making frantic gestures, I'd like to say, and of course I'm ready to answer questions, the last thought I want to share with you is that journalists are not living outside of the framework of society. And I think that 20 years of Putin's rule had one big effect on the society as a whole, psychological effect. Russia is a country of cynics. And that works very well for the Kremlin, because a cynic doesn't believe anything, and basically that means the cynic is powerless. And that, I think, touched to a large extent media organizations. And although there are some wonderful people still working in Russian journalism, when you remember that the media used to be called mass media, when we talk about returning to normality, that will take a very big effort to believe that there could be ethical standards and there could be journalistic independence in Russia. For now, my feeling is going to be quite a long road.
Thanks, Kosti. It's great. I see this strange smile on the lips of Konstantin Sonin and lots of notes.
He always smiles. He's a sphinx. He thinks he's a sphinx.
And lots of notes to respond to you. But strangely, I will continue by Gleb Cherkasov. The case of Gleb Cherkasov is a very recent one, a very fresh one, because less than 1 year ago, Gleb was chief of political department of Kommersant, and he resigned with your entire department, demonstratively resigned from the Kommersant as a protest against unfair firing of your colleagues. It was because of the pressure of Alisher Usmanov. What do you think about this defense of the team? What do you think about if it's the only way to resist censorship, to leave the media and to refuse to cooperate with the media and to sacrifice your professional interests. Is it just one single and unique way to work? Is to doesn't work in on the condition of censorship.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today after such a brilliant speech by Konstantin Eggert. It's hard for me to think of something new to say, but I am going to try nonetheless. First of all, I'd like to say that there is a certain threshold up to which you can keep on working and continue to defend your position, but then there's a certain threshold after which it becomes meaningless. But that is up to you to decide where that threshold is. And there are no formal definitions where that line is. And my personal position was that myself and my colleagues, who I was managing and we ourselves made that decision based on some general principles of, how we cover news, who's going to be our newsmakers, and how we are protecting our sources. And especially, we've felt the most resistance on those last two aspects, because Konstantin, of course, was very correct when he said that there's political pressure, there's also shareholder pressure, and also another difficulty that's been evolving over a period of time. For example, if you take Kommersant of 2006 and the same paper in May 2019, because after that I wasn't working there. But if you will see that in May 2007, 24 pages of advertisement for banks, for construction, any type of advertisement that you would want. It was a very thick, colorful paper, and there were pages and pages of advertisement, and we also had two magazines that did not run any ads. But if we now look at 2019 and we look at the advertisement, we'll see that there's half as much of advertisements. And it is a newspaper now that doesn't have a lot of advertisement. And you know that the less advertisement you have, the less you're dependent on external circumstances. And so it's very difficult to toe the line and difficult to defend your position under these circumstances. And it was actually very simple for us. After two of my colleagues were fired without any basis, after they published a rather ordinary article, and if you look at this article, you don't even understand why it caused such a reaction. It was not an attempt to undermine the government in any way. I don't know how anybody would even think that that article about the Speaker of the Federation Council would be considered undermining the government. But I felt that I no longer have any moral right to work in that paper, and I left. And with me, several of our colleagues also left. And so I don't know how things are run there now. I know that they have a new people, and I don't really know them, and I don't really follow what they're doing there. But I would like to say that now we are seeing a very amusing situation, I would say, that could be considered a remake of what Eggert was talking about. 1990. A remake of 1990, when you came to a brand new newspaper and asked for a job. You know, at that time we had Pravda, Izvestia, the titans of Russian Soviet journalism. We had Soviet journalism titans along with small little newspapers that looked a lot weaker, a lot smaller, a lot less stable, but nonetheless, you know, some of them died off, but some of them played a very important role in the 90s, and Kommersant was one of them. It just held on to the market for 30 years, and now we are living at a time of technological revolution in the media. And it is much easier now to create your own media than it was 5-10 years ago. And so it's really incomparable what technological advances we have now with those that we had in the 90s. And so if you want to create some kind of product, all of us can have the tools. It may not necessarily be professional, but we have the technological basis to just pull out a phone and be newsmakers. For a year, and maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, nobody makes reporting on their phone. Deutsche Welle does from beginning to end, full-scale reporting. Well, maybe what I mean is that over the past year and a half, like mushrooms after a rain, we see small media projects that are being done by young people, very different young people. These media projects are about various news and various themes and cover different subjects. But the pioneers of this work, Elizaveta Yesetinskaya, Media Zone. The process is evolving, and that's I personally call this, maybe somebody else can think of a more exact definition, but I call it Media 3.0. It's usually a small partnership of people who are not connected with the official media market, who produce a product satisfying their own professional ambitions. Usually these projects are not very long-lasting. But if we remember the 90s, many of them also died off very quickly. But these new media startups and projects are acquiring experience in cooperation in producing media content. And what makes that particularly special and different now? They are doing what they are interested in themselves, what their readers and watchers are interested in, not necessarily the most classic things. I mean, for the past 10 years that I worked for, sort of classic media giants, but when you are a media manager, first of all, you have to think about your responsibility before the people that work for you, that they do not get punished for what they do. Your second task is to live the day without major cataclysms, because every day you're expecting that phone call, and it is very nerve-wracking. And then your third priority is to come up with some story that will receive a lot of clicks, becomes very popular, but would have no repercussions. Usmanov saved a drowning puppy. That's for the radio. We were a serious publication. And your fourth priority is your reader. And you know, if you went out to the streets and asked people what they thought about, what they were interested in, that was our last priority. And that was really sad. That is very regrettable. But nonetheless, that order of priorities is burning you out very quickly. It's a burden, and it is very difficult to withstand that for a very long period of time. And when you are a manager, you remember how it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. You know how it was before then. And I'm also a historian, by the way. And historians were, I guess, popular as new recruits for the mass media. And I was one of them. But there was once an incident when one of my colleagues wrote an official request to the government requesting commentary on a very innocent subject. So he sent this request to the agency. The agency that received this request called the management. They called the board of directors. I don't know who particular on the board of directors received the call. And then from the board of directors, that person called the chief editor, and 20 minutes later, chief editor came to me with my request that I sent. You know, I put my name so that I could receive the response quickly. He asked me, why are we writing about this? And I asked him, you know, how did you get this request? I mean, we're not trying to find some state secret, some military secret. It would take such a long time to even explain what we wanted to find out. So while I was trying to make sense out of it, the chief editor went to the correspondent, who was 23-year-old person at the time, and asked again, why are we writing about this? And so we had to explain to this correspondent that he needs to get that request approved before sending it on to the government agencies. And so I feel actually good now, since I no longer am a journalist, that I don't need to convince people why certain news are worth covering and why certain things are important and why are we sending these requests. And why I'm talking about this new media 3.0 is our new chance. And they are, of course, much simpler, much more primitive. They do not comply with the journalistic standards because these people have not been trained properly. These are activists for whom their activism is more important than anything else. And we can see that those things that were just on the sidelines just a few years ago is now taking over the market and going up to the forefront.
It is very personal. It is very emotional things. Now it's Konstantin Sonin who looks all this from abroad, who is he's not a journalist, who is a teacher, professor, scholar, and for you, all the journalism and all these years of columns in Vedomosti is just a game, and maybe just a pleasure. How you like all this? Is for you the censorship is only self-censorship? Because we don't have a redaction, we don't have a newsroom. We're just independent, and nobody exerts this pressure of you. No.
Okay, thank you, Sergei, for starting with the notion that I'm not a journalist.
I'm not a journalist.
I mean,
Sure.
I'll come back to this. Actually, that's what I'm going to concentrate on. Now, that of course, I sort of feel frustration when I was invited for this roundtable because the people that are sitting here, they were giants when I was a student. So when I was a student, I knew all the three names as a journalist because I read a lot when I was a kid and a student. So I felt that only my academic credentials could compensate for this. Not 500 columns for Vedomosti over 16 years and 500 more columns for other media. I was a columnist for Oganyok, for God's sake. Not okay. So what I wanted to talk about, I wanted to say a couple of words about theory of censorship, because I have academic papers on media freedom and censorship. Both we worked both with data and both with theory, but censorship is not that a simple thing. So censorship is authoritarian leaders, authoritarian regimes, they trying to impose censorship basically for two reasons. One reason is that theoretically censorship improves stability of the government. So basically the leader fears for his power, so he wants people to be not organized against the regime, so censorship is needed for this purpose. And I think the second main reason why leaders want censorship, because they just do not want bad things said about them, right? So I think a lot of frustration at the top echelons of the Russian government with the media freedom is not that they really fear a revolution or they really fear that they're going to be punished for their corruption, but they just find that it's extremely unpleasant to read about their corruption, so they dislike it. But censorship also has costs, and the main cost is that people are misinformed. And when people are misinformed, then people might not get the information from the alternative sources, but they still know that they are misinformed. So when I was a kid, when you were adults in the Soviet Union, all people knew that what we get in the news is not true or truth, or at least it's kind of a truncated truth. And this actually perhaps one of the explanations why the Soviet propaganda and the Soviet government spent much larger resources, and had a much stronger capacity because of the repression capacity to impose propaganda on Soviet citizens. That's why it was so ineffective in the late 80s, because people just didn't believe anything that they would say. So this is an actual cost of censorship. That's why they cannot actually close all the print media. They cannot stop information flows because there is a cost to this. But I wanted to talk about some other things about current censorship, and I will start with the print media, and then say a couple of words about television. So one thing is that people in academia, and not only people in academia, but every commentator who discusses structurally the censorship in the Putin's regime tends to sort of over-rationalize it. So it's basically they imagine a much smarter and much kind of more sophisticated force than there is there. Like most of episodes of the censorship, of the post-publication censorship that I've witnessed was basically replacing good journalists with bad journalists. It was not like replacing a good journalist with the journalists who would be, or editors who would be as sophisticated, but have a kind of different ideological agenda. So it was not like replacing Rachel Maddow with Tucker Carlson. It was just to have a media with a strong editor, and then just remove the strong editor and appoint nobody, or just a person with a much lower personal capacity. And this is basically the main act of censorship. So like censorship, I would say it's censorship by mediocrity or something like this. So I think in the print media this happened many times. So like look at the recent examples, what happened in Lenta, what happened in RBK. The editorial teams were not replaced by ideologists. These were people who just less capable than the previous teams. They're actually good journalists, that those whom they replaced were excellent journalists. So this is a kind of censorship by punishing, and censorship by regression to the mean. This is a little bit different with the television, because on television they do a kind of pre-publication censorship that we had in the Soviet Union in the print media, but we do not have in the current Russia. But still, there are a lot of episodes in which the censorship goes through the appointment of people who are actually sort of incapable of producing breaking news, right? So a lot of talk show hosts, a lot of news anchors, they're just like the human quality, the journalistic quality is just way lower than it was in the 90s. And this is like the means of censorship. Finally, I wanted to note one thing is that we think that there is a lot of censorship going on in Russia today. But there are areas in which there is almost no censorship. One thing is like book publishing. For example, if you come to a bookstore, and Russia has now a huge density of bookstores. You wouldn't imagine how dense bookstores are in Moscow. Then Boris Akunin books will be everywhere, right? And he's certainly blacklisted from the Russian TV, and he's sort of grey-listed from all kind of events. And the same, there is a long list of authors who are blacklisted on Russian TV, but they sell their books freely and enjoy wide audience. So there is a kind of a whole area that is not covered by censorship. Okay, I'll probably stop here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have never self-censored myself.
Oh,
Lucky you.
Okay. Frankly, when I spend most of the year in Chicago, and I spend every year 3 months in Moscow. So when I write something political, so against the president, then I need to be in Moscow to write this. So I'm not writing anti-Putin columns from abroad. Is it self-censorship?
Depends on the angle.
yeah, sure. Kostya, you have to answer this.
Self-censorship and columns. Let me take it a bit further. I think that there is no when one tries to figure out the system, what exactly these people in the Kremlin want to achieve. It is more complex than, let us say, the Soviet days. In the Soviet days, it was very clear. The picture that was presented was very clear. Russia is the best, or the Soviet Union is the best place in the world. Everything else is... outside of Russia, there are good people. There are good Americans, good British people, good Germans, whatever, that would like to live like the Soviet people, but they are being prevented from doing this by the, whatever, imperialist Zionists, you name it, and global capital. The whole idea of Soviet ideology, as I remember it from the 70s and 80s, was about how decent, how morally right Russia is, and at the same time, how basically people should strive to something better that this Russia, or rather this Soviet Union, represents. The Soviet system as a beacon to the whole world. Now, I don't find it in the media today. I think that and that is something I tried to touch upon. I think that what the current media setup tries to sell, and I'll come back to censorship in a sec, is actually cynicism. The biggest export of Russian media via Sputnik and RT is also cynicism. That's deliberate. Cynicism and conspiracy theories. Like if you don't have water, running water in a house, it is because Obama sent a group of Navy SEALs to blow up the water pumping station 2,000 kilometers away. Or worse, it's because, Freemasons in DuPont Circle decided that that's going to be in Novosibirsk. I think that weird mix of conspiracy theorizing and cynicism is very beneficial for the government and will have a long-lasting repercussion on Russian society, when Putin is gone. Because it creates a worldview in which, nothing depends on you, so you need some godhead to run the show for you. And secondly, you don't want to do anything because of that. So why go and stage a rally to protest anything if the world is run by dark forces that are completely out of your control? Moreover, what is important is that when I worked for the BBC, just give you one example, I was always explaining, this is my good friend Danila from Radio Liberty, who also worked with me then. And at that time, this was fairly vegetarian times of early Putin, we could still do tours of Russian universities. And I would explain how the BBC works, and have a royal charter, and have independence, and this and that, blah, blah, blah. Eventually, everywhere, in any place, from Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk to Kaliningrad, someone will stand up in the audience and say, yes, Mr. Eggert, we heard it, it's all very fine. But tell us, how do you get instructions from the British government? And there is no force in the world, I don't possess it anyway, that could convince people that the BBC doesn't take instructions from the British government. The BBC has a lot of other problems, but it doesn't take instructions from the British government, no matter what this government is. And I think that this idea that there is no democracy, it's all a sham, anywhere else, all this talk about human rights and media freedoms, it's all a way of exercising power. It's all a way of sort of blindsiding the society. In fact, everything is run by military-industrial complex, the capitalists, whoever. The Rothschilds, that's very important. You recognize that, right? This has a specific impact on the Russian society because Russian society is very insular. It's fairly poor outside of major cities, and Russian society doesn't travel. Europeans and Russians poke fun at the US usually. They don't know where Paris is. Right. I think that the number of passports in Russia is probably, percentage-wise, a third smaller than in the US. That means, and I'm finishing, that means that when the Kremlin tells its henchmen in the media to say whatever they want about NATO, about Obama, Donald Trump, Emmanuel Macron, global economy, people take it at face value because they have absolutely no reference point. They've never been abroad. A lot of them have never been to Moscow, St. Petersburg, to compare and say, well, hold on a sec, that's not right. And this is what I think constitutes the most effective, until now, the most effective tool of propaganda, which actually censors not your views, it censors your mind.
Maybe just a few words about Russian book editors, because that's true. It's a very interesting case. We have for sure less censorship in book editing, but we have to know that the volume of Russian book market was this as big as the Polish one in 2015. And now Russian book market try to be as big as the Belgian one. So Russia as a book country is something between Poland and Belgium, except just one thing, just school books. The print runs of school books is huge, that's evident. So normal print run for Russian books is between 2,000 and 5,000 copies. And one more thing, the most important censor for Russian book editor, it's not a state censor, but it's a book commercial. But it's libraire, the bookstore, because we have lot of case when Russian book was edited but not sold, but refused by the book change, by the book commerce.
Sure, I already know more about the book business than I ever wanted to, because my son is a professional writer who just published his first book. But
we will see. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. He already
Inspiration is a strong point. Yes.
He already sold the first print, the first 2,000. So, okay. Now, I wanted to say that those authors who are actually blacklisted on TV and would not be invited to kind of a good round table in a state university, they still publish their books, and then
yeah, absolutely. So we have a half an hour for questions, and for sure the first is Karina Arlova. It's absolutely evident in this auditorium. No.
Thanks.
Please.
Thank
yes.
you.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, my name is Karina Orlova. I'm a colleague of Sergei Parhomenko on Echo of Moscow. So I have a short question for Konstantin Sonin. Why is that you have to be present in Moscow when you write anti-Putin columns, that they can, arrest you or put on trial? I'm just kidding. But honestly, I liked two of your points that you said that the two, several downsides of censorship is that people stay misinformed, and that bad editors and bad journalists replace the good ones, right? So do you, all of you, think that Vladimir Putin might have fallen victim of his own bad practices, because whatever he reads, it's all censored, by the people who try to be to please him? And is he really well informed at all? Because, and it's important because he makes decisions based on what he knows. So the question is what he really knows. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, when I'm writing something in a column, then it should be credible. And when you say something brave from the safety of Chicago, this is not that credible. So typically, if I write something political, then I need to be in Moscow, because I want the readers to find what I write credible. On the second thing, I think that President Putin lives very much in a sort of informational bubble on many frontiers. So he's sort of a victim of the propaganda machine, especially with respect to foreign policy. But what we've learned, I think, not only in Russia, but in the United States and elsewhere, that people who might be considered ill-informed from the standpoint of an observer, people who have a kind of very conspiratorial worldview, they could be highly functional and actually highly successful as politicians. So the fact that Putin's worldview might look as sort of very closed and not well informed about many things, certainly there is no short-term price for this. There might be a long-term price, but there is no short-term price for this. And President Putin is not the only example.
Yeah.
Hi, hello. Andrzej Dąbrowski. I work for the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon. And my question is about the censorship methods and instruments that the Kremlin has installed and is trying to install on the internet. I was wondering if you have an opinion on that, and do you think that this might maybe go towards the China model, or maybe it will be like a light version of the China model? And how do you think this will influence the ongoing situation in the internet independent blogosphere, people, individuals publishing on their own behalf? Thank you.
Gleb, maybe it's for you.
I am afraid to be seen as an optimist, but it's not possible for us to have the Chinese way in the full measure of it, because fighting other points of view on the internet is such a profitable business. It's very irrational would be to close it down. It's big money, and I believe that the contra-propaganda on the internet is significant. You can't quite just shut it down. And I believe that some feedback that they need is actually coming from the internet. Not all rulers live in such a complete bulletproof bubble. They do need that information. And if you remember the story of Telegram, when a year and a half ago, the government announced that they're going to block the messenger Telegram, and they couldn't block anything. It was a gold mine for them. And I don't think the Chinese way is going to be Russia way. The story of the sovereign RUNET that we've been hearing about lately is just some technical mechanisms that could be used when necessary. But it is also big money. And then this process is maybe pleasant to undertake,
very
but
briefly,
doesn't
I totally
make
agree
sense
with,
to finish it.
With Gleb. It all touches upon generally this, always there's this question whether Russia will go the Chinese way, or whether Putin will be the new Deng Xiaoping. No, there are not enough Chinese in Russia for that. It's a different mentality and different approach to politics. And I think that not only the propaganda machine is being fed by constant, sort of sometimes imitation fight with foreign enemies, but I also think that, and that, by the way, goes also for example, things like travel. I think that there are two lessons Putin learned from the late 80s, early 90s, from the Brezhnev days to Yeltsin days. And these two lessons are very simple. One is that inflation is bad. That's why his financial gurus are all on this kind of very, very conservative sort of fiscal side of analysis. And the second thing is that you have to have valves to let the steam out, because the Soviet Union blew up because this pressure cooker was completely plumbed. And leaving these pockets of kind of free thought is the way of opening these valves and letting the steam out, just like keeping all the all Russian airports open. Putin doesn't need all these, smart guys that will go and demonstrate in front of the Kremlin. He wants them to be in Chile and Helsinki, no matter where. And I think that with face recognition, first of all, I don't think it will be effective in Russia. And second, I think this is something that they know will provoke a lot of backlash from people who can be important, and especially from the city intellectuals. And I think that they don't want to provoke. I don't believe in it too.
Okay, thanks. Danila.
Hello. Voice of America, Daniel Gleb. It's very good to see you here, all. My question is how this censorship and self-censorship, actually two questions, how this censorship and self-censorship works together with a overwhelming lie of Russian state TV, which produced every day, every minute, and it was in enormous proportions from 2014. I mean, how do you think it works for the population, for the consumers of the news? Because from one side it's cynicism, from one side it's people from their Soviet feeling. They know that journalism don't tell everything, and at the same time they have this wave of propaganda that comes from TV every hour. And second question, what about coexistence in profession between people who are trying to be uncensored and who are trying to deliver information with those who works like beside them at the same press conferences, at the same media environment, but absolutely obey the rules, and even more, they actually running ahead the train, publishing some blunt lie, and then kind of, okay, we mistake, sorry, that's it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay,
Something for scholar.
I'm not sure I can answer the question about coexistence. That's more of a journalistic question. But I would not. I don't know. This is a contentious point, but I would not overestimate the role of the Russian TV propaganda relative to what's in people's minds. So, like, anti-Ukrainian feelings were there. They just sort of opened them up. Anti-American feelings were there. I'm a great believer in that. There are some things that are more permanent, more constant than like institutions, democracy, dictatorships. Like Masha Gessen has an excellent book, The Future is History, which is basically tells the story of Russian families over the 40 years and demonstrates that some things like world attitudes, they are extremely constant over times. So like presidents come, go, Chernenko, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Putin, but some things stay basically the same. And I think propaganda over the last 5 years exploited these things very much. But it was not vice versa. It was this from people's mind to propaganda, not vice versa.
I think, I'm sorry, but to answer this, I think if Putin and in general Russian authoritarian regime have just one serious problem now is the decrease of Russian TV propaganda, of television firstly, because less and less people just see the TV, the state-controlled chains, and I think it's a irreversible thing. I think it's will be continue like this, and Putin and his team will have to exploit more and more the internet and not TV.
Actually,
propaganda.
Sergey, I wanted to add that what you say, it points out that maybe there will be an interesting experiment there, because I would not be surprised if the Putin's government would want to increase the credibility of TV, like responding to this declined viewership. So they might experiment with putting some opposition leaders back on TV. Because I think they are very much concerned about this falling TV viewership.
Well, see, I think it's the question of communication between the true communication between the Kremlin and the team of major Russian channels, because it's not controlled directly by Kremlin. I think these things, this idea, have to come to Konstantin Eggert first, and maybe it's.
Maybe Konstantin Ernst?
Oh, I'm
Konstantin
sorry.
Eggert.
I'm sorry.
I was just thinking
At some
again,
point it
No,
will be Konstantin
I- I-
Eggert, but
Sure.
now it's Konstantin Ernst.
It's too much Konstantin on this table.
Konstantin
Yes,
Ernst
oversaturation.
is the head of the
Channel One.
CEO of the Channel One.
Yeah, sure. The Konstantin is the most important person in Russian press in general. So
The coexistence.
It's always a personal choice, Daniela. But I stopped considering these people colleagues. That's very simple. And because after all, you may like Putin and what he does, maybe. But that does not mean you have to lie. That does not mean you have to bend things out of shape. That does not mean you have to work for organizations that engage in massive brainwashing. Personally, I look through these people when I see them somewhere, I don't know, at a summit or at a conference or somewhere. I just look through them. And but that's a personal decision. Others may well think that there may be a way of switching it or flipping it and saying, okay, yeah, maybe you should engage with them and try to, scrape the remains of humanity from them. Maybe. But I'm not a psychologist and I'm fairly old, so I don't want to do that. But others may. I mean, human nature is redeemable, so I'm quite serious.
just here, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, I'm from Ukrainian Embassy. My name is Taras Moskalenko.
Excuse me?
I'm from Ukrainian Embassy. My name is Taras Moskalenko. Well, I was kind of wrestling with myself which language to choose while vocaling my question here. But I'll probably just stick to the English for everyone to understand, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, coming back to my question. So we've all seen the metamorphosis of a lot of pretty respectful Russian journalists like Kiselov, who sort of tried to suppress his disgust to Ukrainians, as was pointed out before, when he used to work in Ukraine, in Kiev, and he did a successful job. I personally was one of his fans. And, well, now we all know that he's basically become a synonym to Russian propaganda, and to some Ukrainians, basically a synonym to Putin himself, while he's trying to, throw in some variations of truth. Kiselov, who is...
Dmitry.
I'm sorry, Dmitry.
Not
Kiselov,
Evgeny.
yes, of course. And, well, my question is, will we see the sort of metamorphosis back when the situation might change in Russia? Because obviously, I mean, I know you're laughing because you understand that.
No question. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. We cannot say about each individual personally because some people are really crazy. But I'm pretty sure that when or if there will be a significant regime change, there will be a lot of people who would radically change their position. And on TV, there will be a lot of...
As usual, of course.
Okay, thank you.
Nothing special in the case of Ukraine in this. Absolutely. Yes, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Wendy Reiser. I went to the Columbia University School of Journalism, so I have some interest in this, and I'm a sociologist. There's a lot of concern in the United States about local newspapers, regional newspapers. They're dying, and we don't need to go into the reasons why. But I'm interested in how this plays out in Russia, which is a large country, and it has cities of various sizes. What's the story about local newspapers? Are young people interested in writing for them? Are they a little bit exempt from this onerous oversight, even if it's after the fact? And I'm also interested in the allies of Russia. Do they just take the press releases and the articles knowing they're distorted and run them, or do they have a little bit of distance from what they're fed? Please
define allies. Who are allies?
Well, I'll let you.
I could say that people who write in social media and in blogs outside of Moscow, they certainly have different, they're facing different kind of obstacles. So like people outside of Moscow in provincial cities, they could easily be fined or even go to jail for what is will be no problem in my Facebook or Sergei's Facebook or said on Echo Moskvy. So the conditions are certainly harsher. There are hundreds of people who are punished for just saying something on their social media. This doesn't happen to the media, like big media figures, but this happens to people all over Russia, outside of Moscow. I could, yeah.
I have to answer this question as one of coordinator of Russian Redkollegia program. It's maybe you've heard about the big Russian independent award, and I working here for 4 years now. My answer is about the newspapers outside Moscow. The answer is no. It's no. That doesn't work now. It's not interesting for young people or old people or everybody. We have some exemptions, like for example, the great tiny newspaper in the town of Syktyvkar, sure. And another one on Kudymkar. It's absolutely not in the middle of nowhere. It's in the end of nowhere. And so we have some miracles in this market, but the internet media on the local level work very well. And we have lots of cases when we have very good journalists in very bad situation, in very bad region, or even in very bad media. Because Russian journalism is alive now because of people, because of persons, not because of some newsrooms or some teams or some editions. It became more and more absolutely a personal thing, a personal profession, a personal work because of social media, and on the same time because of the possibility to work on the internet media on the local level. Thanks.
The problem has to do with the fact that the wages in the regions, in the provinces, is a lot less, by several degrees less than in the major cities. And as soon as a journalist, whether he works in the print or in the internet, as soon as he goes, starts to work, he wants to move to a larger city, because as soon as he gets a job in Moscow, no matter what job it is, his standard of living drastically improves. Some enthusiasts do continue to work in the provinces and do continue to herald the new journalism, but in the regions, we see a lot of people leaving. So this constant flow, this constant outflow means that there is not enough people to form a backbone for journalism in the regions.
I have time for last two questions. Karina.
Настя Каримова.
Настя.
Да.
Karina.
My name is Anastasia Karimova. I used to work for Kommersant for several years. And to cut a long story short, I also lost my job because of censorship. And I feel certain responsibility for not speaking up about this topic at the time, and for not trying to organize or mobilize my colleagues who also experienced all these issues. And I wonder, what is your thought on this matter? Do you feel that we as a journalist community have certain responsibility for not being proactive and vocal, and basically tolerating certain aspects of censorship in our day-to-day work? And what would you recommend to the future generations of journalists in the bright Russia future to do to protect themselves and to protect their jobs from censorship?
Вот редактор скажет.
Кто тут про будущее поколение?
Ну, ты про будущее поколение.
Хорошо.
All right, I'll
Добрый день
speak
еще раз.
about the future generations.
Я хочу сказать, что
Anastasia, hello
когда
again.
будет возможность
When
создавать
we
что-то
have
более-менее
an
основательное,
opportunity to create something
нужно не
substantial,
повторить ошибки
we must not
прошлого
repeat the mistakes
периода,
of
а именно,
the
вот
past.
есть эта стенка между
There is
бизнесом
a
и
certain
собственной
divide between
редакцией. И
business
всякий раз,
and
даже
news.
там, где ее пытались строить,
And
вот
when
сейчас
that
мы
wall
там
was
заложим место для кирпичиков,
built, or just the
а
foundation for
дальше
the wall
мы,
was
когда
being
её
built.
достроим, и вот у нас всё
And
получится. Нет ни правил, нет ни
there are no rules,
каких-то
there are no
законных и
laws,
формальных
there are
оснований для
no
защиты. И
formal
в этом смысле
foundation for
каждый раз
such
оборона — это
defense. And
такой
every time we
очень
put up this defense,
личный ручной пример
it is
выхода из кризисной ситуации.
always an example of some
Я не знаю,
personal
честно говоря, я
attempt
проработал в
to
«Коммерсанте» последний раз
overcome the
12 лет.
situation.
Существует устав
I worked at
редакции
Kommersant
или
for
нет? Я
12
не видел,
years. I haven't,
это, как бы так можно сказать, что
I don't know
очень
if
плохо,
there
еще
is,
хуже, что я им не особо интересовался.
if there is a
Наверное,
certain,
в следующее,
maybe I
в какую-нибудь
wasn't
другую
interested
жизнь я этим
enough
поинтересуюсь.
in that
Это первый момент.
aspect of
Второй,
it,
конечно,
and I
очень бы
admit to that.
пригодилась,
But what also I
какая-то основа для финансовой независимости,
think would
потому
have
что
been good to have
для
is a foundation
той
for
степени
financial
государственной
independence,
экономики, которая
because
сейчас есть в России, у нас
the
всё
level of
со
state
неплохо.
control and state government economy that we have now, 60% is owned by the government, everything else is largely affiliated. And so hopefully we'll have new media that will be truly financially independent, who will be surviving due to, their readers paying. And maybe we will have some kind of institutional guarantees for their work. Konstantin Sonin, do you think it's possible?
Through media market inside the authoritarian state. Is it possible in principle?
Okay, I think it's possible. I think Russia has a lot of good journalists, and it certainly does not have
But what about the economic base of this?
No. What I'm saying that it doesn't have anything resembling the Soviet Union level of censorship and propaganda. It's a much freer, whole free environment. So it exists somehow. I'm not sure that in any state-dominated economy, the state media should be that censored as they are in Russia. They should be, I think they are propaganda tools to much more extent than is needed. So I think we could have a vibrant, independent media plus normal state media in Russia.
Okay.
Next time.
Nastya, I think that circling back to what I was saying, I think journalism. First of all, we don't know whether journalism will be what we know it is to be today in 20 years. I think that things change at such a breakneck speed, that I can't even imagine. Anyone could be a media organization. But second thing, that's very important. Media does not exist in a vacuum. And essentially, if the society figures out, the Russian society figures out, that its right to know is an important right for it, then a lot of things will fall into place, and a lot of owners will be also under pressure from society.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Massively not yet.
Not yet. It's always the desire to know. Coming back for a sec to what the Ukrainian colleague was asking about Kiselev and so on. But look, if you want to find out what really goes on in Ukraine, it's not a very difficult thing to do in Russia today. But it's the fact that people shutter their minds because it's easier to think that it's fascists all over the place and we live in a stable country. And I think that journalism will be, again, as it was in the 90s, early 90s, and in the days of perestroika, journalism will be probably reborn and probably in different form when the society is reborn.
I like very much this story that the things of Russia, the idea of Russian society about freedom of press is like an avocado. So, not yet, not yet, not yet, not yet. Eat me, no. Too late. The last question.
Thank you. Kirill Beleninov, journalist. I mean, my question is very simple. I just would like to go to the second topic of the panel about the self-censorship. Simply because censorship, being a Russian journalist for over 25 years, you know, that's nothing surprises me about the censorship, and it's very simple. But now I see, and would like to ask you whether you see this trend again or not, the new generation of journalists in Russia who are honestly support the government, who honestly support the Putin agenda, and they are just not only in the government-sponsored media, but they are like just all over the place. Gleb, probably you have seen this in Kommersant as well. So what is self-censorship, to your opinion, right now? And is it possible to fight it? Is it possible to, is it a new trend or not? Я скажу так,
I'll
что
say this.
мне в тот момент, когда я
At the time when I
работал с
was
молодыми журналистами,
managing
Мне
those young
было
journalists, and I was
совершенно
working
всё
with
равно,
them. I did not
любит он
care
Путина,
at all
не любит
whether
он
he
Путина,
liked
любит он
Putin,
манную
did
кашу,
not like
любит он или
Putin,
не
whether
любит
he liked
овсяную кашу.
porridge or
Человек
did not like
должен был
porridge,
задать
what kind of
вопрос-
porridge he
задавать
liked.
вопросы по
The
той теме,
journalist
которая ему
had to
поручена.
investigate and
максимально,
write on the subject that he is tasked to write on his beat.
Отстраненно
And
или
he
не отстраненно,
must
но как-то
be
всё
objective,
равно взвешенно излагать то,
must
что он услышал.
report objectively what he found out. And I never liked extreme emotionality. I work with people of different political views, but
во всем он за Путина, один человек за Путина, во всем человек против
I never met a
Путина.
person that who was,
Очень многим
you know,
нравится один,
100%
нравится другой.
for
Как они
Putin or
в своих
100%
головах
against.
это,
People
конечно,
would be
всем
usually a
такое классное
combination of things. They would support
не важно,
some
что
things and
думает
not
журналист.
support others. It did not
Важно,
matter
как он
to me
работает,
what
как
the
он
journalist's
относится к своим
personal
обязанностям.
beliefs
Всё
were.
остальное
What was
я
important to me is
допускаю,
how
что,
good of a journalist he was and
знаете,
whether
вот я
he
приведу
was
пример чуть из
responsible
другой
and
области.
objective. I'll
Я
give you a
несколько
different
лет подряд
example.
принимаю творческий
For several
конкурс
years, I
на факультете медиакоммуникации Высшей школы
participated
экономики.
in
Он приглашает действующих журналистов.
in
И
a competition for journalists at the Moscow State
спрашивают,
University, and
принято спросить, что
so
вы читаете?
it was common to ask everybody, "What are you reading?"
Один за другим, поскольку
And one after the other,
положено, говорит, мы читаем
they
«Медузу»,
said,
мы
"We
читаем «Медузу». Я
we
иногда
read
спрашиваю, что вы
Medusa."
там читаете, и так далее.
I would ask them, you know,
И тут как-то
what they read,
что-то,
and they read
не знаю,
Medusa.
я разнервничался.
And
говорю,
once I was a little nervous, and I asked them,
я
"What do you read?"
читаю
And he said,
«Медузу».
"I
Она мне
read
нравится.
Medusa.
Я так
I
на автомате. Она
like
мне не
it."
нравится. Анатолий Голубовский есть
Anatoly Golubovsky is an important, is a famous person, and you know,
Через
and I talked to this
человека
applicant,
заходит еще
let
один
him go,
абитуриент, будущий журналист.
and another
Что вы
applicant
читаете?
comes
И
in,
он
and
так спрашивает.
we ask him, "What
Мне
do
не
you
нравится
read?"
«Медуза».
And he says, "I don't like
Я
Medusa."
говорю, что цыганская почта
And I say,
вывели, да, что если попадаешь здоровый бородатый,
so-
небольшой бородатый, то, значит, большому бородатому надо это сказать.
So-
Ну, в общем, по-моему, не
they
поступил
all
человек,
looked
слава
like they were
Господу.
all in cahoots
Я
with
вот
each
об
other,
этом.
and they were all
Вот таким должен быть.
prepared
А
to say the
как он
same
считает?
thing.
Мы
неоднократно устраивали
And
себя
many
тотализаторы
times
на итоге голосования,
we
всякий раз
had
ставя проценты. Да,
voting and
но мне
voted
никогда в голову не приходило спросить, за кого вы на самом деле
for,
голосовали.
you know,
Я не имею на это права.
sort of had polls about who to vote for, who people were going to vote for,
I
but
wanted to share a related
never
experience from the High
really
School of Economics. I'm a professor at
based my
the
opinion on people
Department of
depending on
Economics,
what
and actually
they
the research advisor
they
of
voted
the
for.
Department of Economics. So for many years I taught an introductory class for undergraduate students, and this class involved a kind of a lot of writing because they didn't know anything in their first year, so they were just writing essays. And what I discovered is that, of course, most of students of the High School of Economics, they are a kind of conservative, right? They're anti-American, they're anti-liberal, but they sort of fear to write this to me because they read my columns, they know that I'm pro-American, very classic liberal, almost libertarian, and it's a kind of clear that half of them, they just fear that if they write what they think about Marshall Plan, and they universally think that Marshall Plan was
Trap.
It was a trap. It's amazing how much of the Soviet times propaganda they have when they come to the first year, but they somehow thought that for me, their political views is sort of important, although they of course not. I mean, I teach them economics. It's totally, I mean, I never judged people on their political views, and in the economics department there, or at the New Economics School, now at the University of Chicago, we have people with all kind of preferences. It's like a total heterogeneity. Yes, we have as many Trump supporters in my department as Democrat supporters. So I don't understand this question. But what I wanted to add as an answer to the question, that it's true that in Russia people somehow relate political views. They see a deeper connection between like professional qualities and political views. They think that like if I am liberal, then if someone interacts with me in a professional capacity, then I sort of use this person's political views against them. I think this is a feature of the Russian life, and I've always attributed this to our Russian inexperience of living in a society with diverse political views and open political competition.
Thank you very much. That's all. It's all our time. Thank you.